Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I broadcast from today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, paying my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are watching us live today on Facebook or LinkedIn, or who catch the replay through either of those platforms or through YouTube. My guest, Christina, whose lands do you come in on from today?
Well, I'm on beautiful Ngunnawal country where we are having a gorgeous Canberra day. It is just one of those blue sky, beautiful days. I also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose country I was born.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Now, we're going to launch straight into today's session because I've got some questions that I'm really excited about to hear from Christina, and I think she's sharing some excitement around some of the questions as well. Don't forget, if you're watching live, to give us comments, questions through the feed on either Facebook or LinkedIn, and if we can get to the questions, we absolutely will, either live or afterwards as well. Even if you're watching on the replay, still feel free to do that.
And that's a howdy to Margarita, who's just popped up a howdy message. Yes, we're getting the messages. Go for it, folks.
Great. So, Christina, to start us off, as usual, I don't introduce my guests. I get them to do it for me. A bit of laziness there. But if you could tell us your story and perhaps maybe leading us up to what was the impetus for you starting the Disability Leadership Institute, which is something that you're running currently.
Absolutely. Oh, try and go the short version so we don't waste our whole time listening to me or hearing about me. I've come from I've spent, I guess I've had a lifetime of activism, right from when I was a very small kid growing up in the women's movement, with the very many aunties I have, and you can currently see their film in Brazen Hussies. Go and check it out in the cinema, people. So I've always been an activist. I've always been a change maker. It's just what I do. It's what people in my family do. It's sort of the family business. And you can Google us. You can have a look on people up there. No, I'm not going to talk about them now. What I've actually spent over the last 25 years, I've done a lot of work in disability activism. So that's been my core space, and particularly the intersection with gender, so feminist disability activism. And about a decade ago, for the first time, I started working for paid work in a disability-specific role, running an advocacy organisation. And when we say advocacy and disability, we don't just mean the systemic work, that's part of it. What we actually mean about advocacy and disability is assisting people to speak. So there's a lot of people in the disability community who don't get to speak for themselves or don't get asked or get sidelined. And that's where advocacy comes in. They might have an advocate who assists them to be heard, or the advocate might understand what that person wants and do the talking for them. There is no such thing as a person who can't speak for themselves, only people who don't get listened to. So I've spent about a decade working in that space. One of the really horrific things that you start to realise is that there is what can only be described as an endemic level of violence against disabled people, not just in Australia, globally. And that's not just about segregated environments. A lot of it is that, so group homes, sheltered workshops, special schools, those sorts of places, but also just an assumption that disabled people are worth less. And over a decade of this, I frankly reached a point where it just was a bit much for me, and I thought I need to get out of this. It actually caused me great illness. Still recovering from that. That's okay. I'm getting there now. And I came to this realisation after we'd had yet another Four Corners episode, and I was talking to my team one day back at the advocacy organisation, and they said, "Why won't people listen to us? Why aren't we being heard? We're saying this over and over again. We're telling people about this all the time. It's being talked about and nobody's listening." And I suddenly realised, had one of those moments of clarity. I said, we're not equal people. We're not considered to be equal. They will not listen to us. Our voices don't matter. And that's when I realised that we needed to get equal. And getting equal means being in the leadership spaces. It means making the decisions. It means being respected as credible, equal members of the community. And the only way you get to do that, in my opinion, is if you get out there and participate in having an opinion, in being listened to, and in making decisions, not just for yourself, but for the broader community. So leadership. We need leadership. And it's an area that's never been focused on. In talking to colleagues when I was first getting the Institute sort of up and running about 5 years ago, we came up with maybe 6, hang on, I have to fit that on the screen, 6, it goes backwards, everybody, sort of maybe 6 specific leadership programs targeted at disabled people over about 20 years. And most of them were location specific or pilot programs or something like that. There had never been any ongoing attention paid to the development of leadership in the disability space. So, hello, Disability Leadership Institute, here I am. I've been doing development, professional development, organisational development for about 20 years, maybe a bit longer, and realised that I had the skills, I had the understanding about adult learning, but I also had a lot of personal experience about operating in leadership spaces that I could pull all of that together and use it for good, hopefully. And here we are. So it's exciting. Been doing it now for 4.5 years.
Yeah, fantastic. There's so many little moments in that story too, that I guess for me the thing that's really standing out is you took the time to sit back and work out, well, what is the actual problem that needs addressing, and what solutions actually going to create change in that space. And that's what we're always advocating for on practical inclusion, is what practically can we do about what seems like at times such massive issues that we just can't get traction on or can't possibly solve. So I really like the way that you've articulated that moving into that action space. This is something, and this is really why I wanted to get you on today, because I am working with a lot of organisations that, are really focused on creating broad diversity and inclusive environments within their organisations. But when you look up to that leadership group, we know the lack of diversity that exists there. And even in organisations that specifically work in health areas or organisations that are specifically delivering services for people with disability, you still don't see representation. Well, I'm certainly not seeing a lot of representation of people who actually have lived experience. What do you think are some of the key barriers that continue to make that the case?
Oh, well, the equality thing. We're just not equal people. There's still this, it's quite interesting when you're on the inside of disability. Interesting way of putting it, but that's sort of how I think about it, I guess. One of the things that starts to become really obvious, in your face obvious, is that people just don't see you as credible. And so it doesn't matter how expert you are at something, it doesn't matter how much experience you've got, it doesn't matter how long your CV is, how intimidating your CV might be, you are never, ever good enough. And we used to have this way back in the 80s with women when we were getting the gender equality thing going. It's very much the case in the disability space, is people just can't quite believe that disabled people will be as good or better than they are. So there's this incredible prejudice that's still there. Another one is the kind of can't hack the pace thing. So, the minute the going gets tough, they won't be able to make difficult decisions, or they'll have to have a day off, that sort of stuff, have to go and lie down for a bit. So it's all wrapped up in the prejudice space. It really is. It is all prejudice. So there's that lack of belief that we are credible people, the prejudice that we're not credible people, the lack of belief that we're capable of doing the tough stuff. When, of course, anyone who knows disabled people, particularly disabled women and female identifying folk, recognises that we're some of the toughest people on the planet. And then there's another one, which is actually we might not be able to get in. I once wanted to be on a board of a particularly prominent community organisation that I have a great love and an affection for. They had an office in an upstairs location that only had stairs. And I just had to say, well, I can't do it. Now, when I look back, that was probably about 15 years ago. When I look back, I think, I should have told them and they would have met somewhere else. They would have had the board meetings in another location. You bet they would have. But at the time, that was a barrier. So the way people talk and the locations people do things in, the way they're not accessible, it becomes the obligation of the disabled person to fix it. And after a while, you just think, too much trouble, not doing it. So you don't end up in those forums, you don't go for those jobs, you don't nominate for those positions because it's just another battle that you have to fight. So they're just some of the barriers, but they're pretty much an everyday one in my experience.
I think there's so much there that is relatable in that gender equity space. But so, as you say, we've moved somewhat down the track, but we still see and hear very similar things, that women don't apply. There was nobody suitable for the role, right? And so we see exactly the same thing happening for people with disability, but what I'm not seeing is a whole range of initiatives to address that we've seen in the gender space.
Yeah.
Do you think? Yeah, sorry, go.
This takes us right back to that first barrier, which is about not actually thinking that we're worth having in the room. Mm-hmm. So we're not in the room often not because we can't get in the room, sometimes it is, but it's usually because nobody thought that we were of value to be in that room. And so that there's this, not just the barrier of attitude, but the barrier of having to battle all the time to say, yes, I know what I'm talking about, which of course women had to do back in the 80s is prove that we were worth it. It's exhausting. There's only so much of it you can do. And in fact, Ainsley's just made that comment, which is a really valuable comment. It is so tiring. You spend your entire time arguing to be included. We had an interesting conversation amongst members of the Institute a few months ago relating to just that, where we were being labelled advocates. And yet we're business people turning up to have a meeting with someone, as a potential client. And what we realised is that we are not just turning up to have that potential client meeting, but at the same time we're having to argue about why what we're talking about is important at all. It's not even on the radar for most people yet.
Yeah, right. And that kind of leads to the next question that I had is what should organisations be doing to turn this around? Because I'm not seeing a lot of action in the spaces that I'm working in. I see some disability access and inclusion plans that are usually expired and there's an intention to redo them, but I'm not seeing a lot of action in their space.
No, and that's because there's not a lot of action. We are very much at the back of the pack in the diversity space. It's horrible to say, but it's true. We're about 40 years behind women. And I reckon we're still about 10 or 15 years behind Indigenous peoples, depending on the circumstances and what field we're talking about. And one of the things that is becoming clear to me is the diversity box is just a bit clunky for people to tick. And the people who are working in the diversity space, polite truth here, but they often aren't very diverse, so there's a lack of diversity in diversity. And so there's a real lack of disabled people generally. And what that means is it's easy to forget we exist. If we're not in the room, if we're not part of the conversation, we get forgotten. It doesn't matter which diversity group you're talking about, which minority group you're talking about, that's going to be the case. It used to be the case with women. All groups, men would have their conversations and they'd forget about how women might interpret things. We're over that now. We've moved on. It's still being fought, but we've moved on. That's where we're still sitting in the disability zone. So people forget we exist. They don't ask us. We're not in the room. Decisions are made. Entire pandemic plans are written without even mentioning disability once, for example. So we're still in that space. We're still having to fight to even be in the room, heard. And it's tough stuff. And it isn't just about being in the room. It's about being valued as a participant once you get in there. So there's still a lot of the, to quote Andrew Dentron, the patronising bastards who they're happy to have us in the room, but they don't get that we might have some value to contribute to ourselves, and don't quite understand that the experience of disability from the inside, as I said before, is very different to my cousin's a disabled person, so I know all about it, which is usually where we're sitting. And that's why the majority of service providers, disability services, the majority of organisations that are working in the disability space in this country and others have no disabled people at the top, including the NDIS, including the department that makes all the policy decisions. They do not have disabled people in the top echelons of those organisations. And it's not a headline issue, and it should be.
Absolutely. I want to tap onto a question that somebody has asked that's a bit too long to post up on the screen, but it really leads into what was my next question anyway, and something we were both really keen to talk about. And the question says, I'm interested to know your thoughts on accountability to children and young people with disability, how adults take their views into consideration in organisations, policy and program design. And I think this kind of leads us into this space of advisory groups and consultation, community consultation or service consultation that we wanted to kind of move into. So did you want to answer that question, and then we might broaden the discussion?
I think we also need to go back to, I was talking about working in an advocacy organisation. Now, advocates can't decide what somebody wants. They have to ask. And many of the people they're asking are people who have what we call significant communication barriers. They might not use talking, or they might use talking, but they actually need the information in a way that is able to be understood by them. And it's up to the advocate to learn how to listen. And working with skilled advocates is, it's a thing. They're amazing human beings. And so it's the same, I would suggest, working with children, whether they're children with disabilities or not. It's about listening. It's about listening. How is it that you think you know? I can't possibly know what you think about something, Bree, other than what you tell me. I can't ascribe a sentiment to you. I have to listen. And listening might not just happen with my ears. It might happen with my eyes. It might happen through a conversation where that person expresses sentiment or discomfort or a preference. There's ways of doing it. So we need to get better at recognising that people talk in all sorts of different ways. When it comes to that inclusion thing, that's about creating spaces where it isn't your space is the right way to have a space. So I'm coming into Bree's space today, but that doesn't mean that I have to behave like Bree behaves in that space. It might be a space that operates so that it's open for everyone to be comfortable in. We're not very good at doing that stuff, and we're really, really bad at doing it in government and corporate and large organisations. We get caught up in thinking my way or the highway. We do it this way. Well, that's the 21st century. We've got all sorts of technology. I've just been explaining to Bree about the live transcribe feature on my phone, so I can talk to you even when I'm wearing a mask. It's, there's no rules here. We can make them up as we go along to suit the situation. We're not very good at that. Bree and I had a bit of a chat beforehand about advisory groups, so let's segue into that, shall we, Bree? It's an exciting race. And, let's try and be polite about it, shall we? They don't work. They don't work. They're wrong. Get rid of them. In my opinion, the only people who should have advisory groups of pick your minority group are people like ministers in government who may not be of that minority group. So they should have a group of advisors who are from that minority group to give them a bit of an understanding. If you're an organisation, there is no excuse. You don't make up for the lack of people on your board and the lack of people in your executive team and the lack of people at management and decision-making level in your organisation by having a bunch of people in the room next door that you speak to when it suits you. And our research at the Disability Leadership Institute, we did some global research a couple of years back. And what we discovered was that advisory groups don't work because when they're in fashion, they're okay. But when they start to say something that's a little bit awkward, they get forgotten or they get sidelined, they get put out there. And so people might get appointed to an advisory group, but their voice is not respected. It isn't valued in the same way as it would be if it was sitting in the boardroom. If that same person was sitting in the boardroom, they have a stake in the decision. According to governance rules, because, hey, I do governance, that's one of my passions. I know it's weird, but it's me. If you're in the boardroom, you are part of the collective decision-making process. Your word is part of what produces the decision. You cannot be discarded in the same way as an advisory group can. So what we discovered is advisory groups are more of a, they're more of a publicity stunt, to be frank, and they make up for a lack of inclusive workplaces. You want to understand what particular minority group of the day is thinking or saying. Why aren't they in your workforce? Why aren't they in your board? Why aren't they in your leadership team? Don't make excuses. Stop making excuses. Just sort yourself out. Get it done. Advisory groups, Bree, what do you think about them?
I just love the way you've articulated this, and I must admit I try and keep myself very open-minded and watching the way different organisations and different sectors use advisory groups. And I know in some sectors it's such commonplace and they see such value in it, but I'm yet to see the evidence that they're actually creating change.
It doesn't. What our research showed is it doesn't actually contribute to cultural change inside organisations. That's the thing. And so if people think this is a road to inclusion, alas, it doesn't. Apparently, all of our research is telling us it doesn't. We still have an organisation that doesn't have necessarily good recruitment practices about pick your minority group. It doesn't point to the fact that the way decisions are made will be inclusive of pick your minority group. It doesn't mean that the board is going to remember that minority group exists. It's particularly pertinent in the disability space. And this year we've seen a lot. The federal government has an advisory group of disabled people and other associated folk. Unlike other advisory groups, disabled people don't get to be our own thing. We usually have parent carers and potentially service providers in the room with us because they provide advice which is considered more valuable than ours, apparently. Oh, I said that aloud. Oh, dear. Anyway, the federal government has an advisory group. The department that actually looks after that advisory group doesn't have any disabled people above a certain level. So all of their decisions about policy and what they're advising the minister don't actually contain anything other than what might come from the advisory group. And let's have a look at what's happened this year. We had a whole bunch of pandemic stuff where there was a federal government plan about the pandemic, didn't even mention disability once. They've got an advisory group. They've got a department doing disability policy, and yet not one mention in the pandemic plan about disability until, the disability community lobbied very hard indeed to get in there. And it's continued on. We've had further examples since, but that's a really startling example. And the Disability Royal Commission just sat there with their jaws on the floor, gobsmacked about it. It's that stuff which tells us that unless you're in the room, you get forgotten. And it's particularly the case when things get a bit urgent, because in a crisis or when something's happening or when the organisation is under pressure, whatever that pressure is, it might be they're on the receiving end of the Royal Commission, who knows. The last thing that you're going to do is take time to stop and have a bit of a think and consult with some other people in the room next door. What you actually do is work under pressure and operate quickly. And suddenly the people who aren't in the room get forgotten.
Yep.
So this is why advisory groups don't work, and it's why it's so critical to look to the leadership groups of any organisation, board, executive team, leadership and decision makers.
Mm-hmm. No, and totally agree. And we saw that that was the case, you know, for gender equality, for LGBTI inclusion, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across the board. That was, yes. As you say, and across organisations, because things are happening quickly and decisions are made, and then down the track they go, oh, hang on, did anybody think about how this impacts women? No, we haven't.
It does. And think about it on your own part. I mean, we're both sitting here being nice white people. You know, I'll make assumptions there about our cultural background as a result of that. When there's a person of colour in the room, suddenly we speak differently because we're a bit more self-conscious. Now, it might still be not okay, but suddenly we are more aware that we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
It's right in front of us. Visibly evident. It's a clunky example, but the same thing happens if somebody is overtly disabled. Not only a small proportion of disabled people are actually visible. You can't tell just by looking with most of us. Some of us, about 15% of us, you can tell by looking. But then, of course, it's about identity. So we're just talking about the LGBTIQ community. That's about identity. So is being Indigenous. It's about who you decide you are. Same with disability. You can't decide I'm disabled. It's down to me, Bree. I make that decision. I do, and I come with a big piece of hardware, which is also handy to see. But it's that stuff that people don't get. And the more you are marginalised as a community, in my experience, the less likely it is that you will be able to make that identity decision for yourself. It is put onto you. And so in disability, we are still... Our disabilities are decided by others and not us. It's really demeaning, actually. Yeah. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it would be. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. We've got a little bit of time. I just want to quickly throw to you about the ideas of quotas. So we do, you know, I absolutely advocate for quotas when it comes to gender, but my discussion with the organisations is always, but what about everybody else? And people find this really difficult to get their heads around, how they could actually put something in place that drives recruitment decisions and proactivity around a broader idea of inclusion. What's your quick response to that?
Well, it's not working, is it, folks? It's not working. You think we can't do it that way, so you haven't been doing it that way, and look what we've got. A lack of diversity. So, in fact, quotas, which have been proven to work exceptionally well in many other countries, mainly about women, is an answer. Now, when we've got a certain critical mass starting to look like it's happening, let's talk about the fact that quotas aren't as vital. But the reality is we're not going to have minority people in the room unless there's some sort of circuit breaker. Quotas are a good one. Targets, okay. If you want to be nice about it and you're feeling a bit sort of shy, a bit timid, go for a target. In my experience, targets don't work. The public sector's had them for years. And what have we got? Lack of diversity. So we need to do something differently here. And a lack of quotas and targets isn't it. We've tried that. Decades of trying that. No diversity. Yeah, let's get the targets happening.
Yeah. Great answer. Let's sum this up. I want to just highlight a few things here that you've spoken about, and one that I've really picked out is the word listen. And this has become a recurring theme, and I think we really need to keep honing this in and getting people to understand that we have to have people from diverse backgrounds in the room at the decision-making table, and if they're not, they have to be listened to. And their voices included in those decisions.
Absolutely.
The other thing.
Thanks, Ash, for the nice comment. But yes, and we don't have to know. I don't need to be an expert in the areas that I'm not an expert in. I know what I know. Bring that to the table. Get other people to the table who have the other experiences. You don't have to know it all. You really don't. Sorry, Bree, interrupted there.
No, the one other thing I wanted to pick up, because I haven't really heard this articulated strongly before. And for me, I always admit that the disability space is a real learning spot for me, because that's not where my work experience has been, and certainly not my lived experience. But what you've said here about that people with disability are seen as not credible enough. And I think we all need to sit and challenge our ideas, assumptions and biases around that piece to really start shifting. And as I always say, don't just be aware of your bias, practically do things and put things in place that can prevent the bias from impacting your decisions. So go away and think about recruitment processes and opportunities that pop up and how people are being selected for them.
And you might not be the expert. Get someone in who can help you with being an expert in that space.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of them. We've actually got a new business directory on the Disability Leadership Institute website. It's full of consultants who are experts in all sorts of stuff relating to disability. Yes.
Excellent. Love it. And we might post those links up on the YouTube. So reminder, everybody, we're going to have to cut it there. Reminder is, if you do want to share or listen to this again, I will be putting it on YouTube, and it will have captions with it by the end of the day. So you can jump across to my YouTube channel, which is Bree Gorman Consulting, and subscribe there, and you can catch. We do this every week. So with a different guest. If you have guests, if you have topics, send them through to me. Christina, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're so incredibly busy, and I feel really privileged that you've given us our time and shared with us your knowledge and thinking in this space. So thank you.
Oh, it's been an utter blast, Bree. Thanks for having me.
Beautiful. Catch you next week, everybody.